Okay. We'll refer to this as one cardiac cycle from now on. One cardiac cycle means that we're talking about all the electrical stuff that happens within that cardiac cycle. And one cardiac cycle would be basically one beat of the heart. What is this wave?
P wave.
What does it represent?
Atrial contraction.
Good. This is
QRS complex.
good. So this is the
QRS.
So we call it QRS complex, and it represents what?
Ventricle depolarization.
Ventricles.
Depolarization of the ventricles, and this is
Repolarization.
T wave, and it represents what?
Repolarization of the ventricles.
Of the ventricles. Okay, good. So when we look at this, there's a few things that we need to discuss. Okay. First of all, I'll come back to that. So the PQRST complex, this cycle, is all of the autorhythmic stuff that's happening and all of the contractile stuff. So when we see the P wave and you say atrial depolarization, what cells are we really talking about when we look at the P wave?
Autorhythmic cells?
SA node.
Good? Any other guys?
SA and the what are the ones that go from SA to AV?
And most stuff after that. SA node.
Okay, so I'm hearing SA node, autorhythmic cells.
They're contractile, aren't they?
Those are contractile cells. Yeah. So when we look at the P wave, that is telling you what is happening to contractile cells. It is the depolarization of contractile cells. If you look at the numbers of cells in the heart, the number of autorhythmic cells compared to the number of contractile cells is ridiculous in the ratio. A very small ratio of autorhythmic cells, a very large ratio of contractile cells. We can't see the polarization of autorhythmic cells on an EKG because our EKG is not sensitive enough to do that. We need millions of cells all acting electrically for us to actually see it show up on an EKG. Our equipment is simply not sophisticated enough. So when you see the P wave, it represents a whole lot, including autorhythmic cell activity, but the P wave itself is a direct representation of what happened to the contractile cells. Does that make sense? I don't care if it makes sense. Do you understand that, what I just said? I'll get to the making sense part. It is a direct idea of what happens to the contractile cells in the atrium. So the P wave are contractile cells. The QRS complex, depolarization is depolarization of what?
Ventricles. Contractile cells of the ventricles.
Good, the contractile cells of the ventricles. Does that make sense? Okay. When on here does the SA node fire?
Before the P wave.
Before the P wave. Because none of the contractile cells can experience the depolarization until the autorhythmic cells give it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the SA node is going to fire somewhere around here, where we won't see it. We won't see SA node depolarization. It's too slight. We're talking about, I don't know, a few hundred cells. We can't see that. We need a few million to be able to see it. So the SA node is going to fire first. Does that make sense? The SA node is then going to send it where?
To the AV.
AV node.
To the
Walker's
different
bundle.
and through the multiple channels.
Where's the SA node going to send it? Where are the SA node going to send it?
Autorhythmic cells.
Contractile cells?
Where is the SA node going to send it?
Somewhere.
To the atrial pathways. That's right. The SA node is going to send its signal first into the atrial pathways. The next set of autorhythmic cells. So the atrial pathways are going to get it right here, pretty much at the start of the P wave. Because the atrial pathways are going to send it where?
To the contractile
Contractile
To the contractile cells. And
To the AV.
To the
and to the AV node. So right here, we're starting to get, so I'll change this with a different color. So right here, we have atrial pathways. Don't be confused by my AP. It's not the AV node. I'm just abbreviating, so I have room to write it. So these are the atrial pathways that actually get the signal, yes? And along with the atrial pathways is also the atria itself. And when I say the atria itself, I mean the atrial contractile cells. The atrial pathways and the atrial contractile cells start getting the signal. And the atrial pathways continue to get it all along here. Yes? Okay. Pretty darn close to that. Not far off. Any other questions?
What are you looking for?
More colors.
It doesn't matter. So not far after that, and reasonably close to that, what else gets the signal? Yeah, the AV node.
Before the P.
The AV node is going to get it as well. So we get the atrial pathways, the atria, and the AV node are all getting that signal pretty darn close after the SA node is fired. Does that make sense? Okay. What does the AV node do with it?
Slows it down.
Yeah, it delays it.
Hold it.
It delays the signal. So that AV node is actually going to hold that signal for a window of time. That AV node is going to hang on to that signal for a window of time, while the atria continues to finish its depolarization, and that signal spreads through all of the atrial contractile cells, of which we get to see that. We don't get to see what the AV node is doing with the signal. We just get to intuit what the AV node is doing with that signal based on everything else that we see. Does that make sense? After the AV node gets the signal, then what?
Travels down the bundle of his.
Good. So then we get the bundle of His, and then what?
Purkinje fibers.
Right and left bundle branches.
Good. The bundle branches, and then what?
Purkinje fibers.
Good. And then the Purkinje fibers, and then what?
Contraction of the ventricles.
And then the contraction of the ventricles. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So everything in what we refer to as the PR interval, which is what?
Beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QR.
The beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS. Everything in the PR interval is representative of all autorhythmic cells and atrial contractile cells. And yes, you can argue when I say all autorhythmic cells that the SA node falls outside of that, and yes, those few hundred cells that are the SA node falls outside of that, but we just lump it together at that point. But you're right, it does fall outside of that. So all autorhythmic cells and all the atrial contractile cells have depolarized by the end of the PR interval. Does that make sense? Leaving only one kind of cell left to depolarize, which is what?
Ventricle contractile.
The ventricular contractile cells. That's all that's left. Make sense? So when we're looking at our EKG, everything before the QRS complex is everything related to atria and everything related to the autorhythmic cells. Okay? From the QRS complex down, it's related to, in normal physiology, it's related to the contractile cells of the ventricles in some fashion. Questions on that?
Does the QRS also relate to the repolarization of the atrium?
No. So the timing, so we do have repolarization of the atria, and if we were to see it, it would be approximately around the time of the QRS complex, and we would see this wave right here. So yes, it is there, and we call that a TP wave, which we don't see because of
But it's
it's
there.
so slight because it's mixed into all of the convolution of everything else that's going on. But it does have to repolarize.
So you could say the QRS, that time frame would also be part of repolarization.
Yes, that is correct.
Do we see it on a block where the P wave and the QRSs
You really don't.
don't.
You really don't. The reality is that you just don't. It's so slight that it doesn't electrically show up very often. Yeah. Good so far? Yeah, it's a T wave. But it's not a wave I'm asking you to know, because you're never gonna see it.
You sure?
I don't want you to know something that you're never gonna see. Okay, so then I have a couple questions for you off of this. Y'all know axes, yes? This is a y-axis, and this is an x-axis on graphing,
Mm-hmm.
yes? What is the x-axis of an EKG? Time. Time ticks away this direction, yes?
Yes.
The SA node is going to fire first, then the atria is going to fire, then there's a delay, then the ventricle is going to fire, then there's a little bit of window of time, then it's going to repolarize, then there's a window of time, then the P wave goes back again, right? It's time ticking away this direction. So, and my drawing is definitely not to scale, but it's reasonable. I've exaggerated the scale a little bit. But if you look at this, what is the difference in time related to the P wave activity and the QRS activity? Yeah, what took longer?
The P wave.
What's that?
The P wave.
Yes, but think about that for just a minute. How many cells are we talking about in the atria compared to how many cells we're talking about in the ventricles?
Not as many.
Not as many. So, okay, wait a minute here. If we don't have as many cells in the atria compared to the ventricles, why on earth did it take longer for the P wave to happen than the QRS complex?
Because the AV node delays the signal.
But the delay is all in here. So, okay, here it is. right?
Innervation,
Because it's
So
not
here we
as
go.
strong as a
Right?
contraction.
Here's the AV node,
intervention,
right?
innervation.
But the signal that went down to my AV node, there's a signal being delayed here, but what delayed the signal into the atria? Everywhere else.
There's an innervation of the ventricles.
Did anything delay that signal into the atria?
No.
No. So the atria wasn't delayed at all. It got the signal immediately, it was firing immediately, there wasn't any problem at all in that. Right?
Being distracted.
Yes? Okay, so if nothing delayed the signal into the atria, and the QRS complex, is there anything delaying it in the ventricles? Is there anything delaying it inside the ventricles?
No.
No.
No, the only delay we have is what's happening inside the AV node itself. So presumably, the signal going from the SA node to the atria would be the same as the signal going from the AV node to the ventricles. Yes? The AV node after its delay, right? When it's sending it on.
Is it because the monitor is reading the delay over the actual?
Nothing to do with the monitor. This is what the heart is doing.
Force of the muscles.
Is it a slower contraction of those muscles?
If I pull a cell out of the atria and a cell out of the ventricles, and I set them side by side and stimulate them, they're going to do the exact same thing.
So what is it in the AV node that causes that delay?
Is
I'll
it
try to say this a different way. The delay in the AV node has absolutely nothing to do with this. There's nothing. So here's the deal. You have atrial contraction, and you have ventricular contraction. Yes?
Yes.
This atrial cell and this ventricular cell are going to respond the exact same to the signal that's coming into it. Exactly the same. The signal from the AV node into the ventricular contractile cells is the same as the signal from the SA node into these contractile cells, presumably.
Are contractile cells the same, or the algorithmic cells the same?
The algorithmic cells are the same as well.
Is there
So-
more intervention of,
What do you mean by that? I don't know.
I mean,
Is-
there's more fibers, there's more connections to the ventricular,
What do you mean?
Is
the Purkinje fibers,
What are Purkinje fibers?
they spread the signal out more,
How so?
they're like a tree where it branches off, and it branches off more as a figure, as opposed to being two arms going contract. It goes like this, and all the muscles that are touching the branches can now fire at the same time, as opposed to only the few that touch the big fibers of the atrium.
So does that mean that
in
the
in the
atria,
ventricle, the cells are closer to an autorhythmic cell than in the atrium.
is that,
Yeah, that'd be what I'm saying.
does the signal pass cell to cell after it's,
If you also notice a difference in the shape of the waves from the P wave to the QS complex, what's also different about the shape of the waves?
rounded and long and sharp and short?
Good.
Narrow.
Yeah, they're very sharp, and so they're not just less in time, but they're also very distinct and peaked. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And yeah, and you're hitting on the correct answer, right? So if I have,
More branches of fire all at the same time.
Come on in.
Join us for the conversation. It's fun.
You're gonna sneak in.
Like,
Basic
very.
A basic student goes, I don't want none
Oh,
of
that was a
that.
basic student.
Titanic sank?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Water came in and gave above the whole thing.
Okay.
What?
You know which astrological signs say, prediction
Actually,
that
what did
Titanic?
happen is there was a fire.
Wait, what was that question?
You know what astrological sign people had that survived the Titanic? That didn't survive the Titanic?
None, because they all died.
No, Leo's.
Leo.
Alright, so, here we go.
Where was that?
Seriously?
That was me.
Oh,
Seriously?
yeah.
Half the room doesn't have any answers.
Leonard,
Yo.
I finally, oh, yeah.
I've never
So,
seen the movie, and I
Think
know.
of having a bunch of glasses of water here, and I've got a pitcher of water, yes?
Yes.
And I start filling up this pitcher with water, and at some point in time, you get to a point where the water starts to fill up this one. And the water starts to fill up this one, and the water starts to fill up this one, and starts to fill up this one, yes?
Yes.
And then at some point in time, this one gets filled up to the point that we have the back pressure to allow this one to fill, this one to fill, this one, and they all eventually fill. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
If these were heart cells, these would be my what?
Contractile.
My gap
Oh,
junctions.
gap junctions.
Okay? And that is exactly how depolarization within the atria happens. And so we have a nice rounded wave that is happening because of that. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. This is also how the ventricles are set up. They are set up exactly the same. The atria and the ventricles are set up exactly the same.
Just more pictures?
Nope. I don't know how else to describe exactly. Nope. Okay, yes, you have more pictures in the ventricles. You have more pictures, so you're right. So it's not exactly. You have to add more pictures here. But if I were to add more pictures here, then what should my waveform do?
Get longer.
It should take longer, and how should the peak of it be?
Very low.
Yeah, rounded and higher, rounded and higher, right? So the infrastructure of the ventricles and the infrastructure of the atria are exactly the same. But there is something different added to the ventricles as well. So even though the infrastructure, the foundation is exactly the same, we have Purkinje fibers in the ventricles that we do not have in the atria. And the Purkinje fibers are an added set of cells that are there that would do this to it.
Drip water every single.
So we are now filling the Purkinje fibers very quickly, and the Purkinje fibers are dropping water into all of them at the same time. This is still happening. We still have the gap junctions happening. But because we have this huge, big, long piping system that dumps water all at the same time into all of those glasses at the same time, this cell doesn't have to wait for this cell to finally fill enough to give it water, because it's already filled up at the same time, because they're all filling at the same time. Does that make sense? Because they are all basically filling at approximately the same time, not very much time passes. And because of that, or in addition to that, because they're all filling at once, we don't have a depolarization that looks like this. Depolarize, 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 all the way down the line, one sequence after the next. Instead, we have a whole ton of them that depolarize at the same time. So we get a peak to it. We get a narrow peak to it because they all fired at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. What would happen if something occurred in the ventricles that wiped out the Purkinje fibers?
It would look like the P
Why the
wave.
QRS?
It would become a rounded wave, and
Mm.
it would take longer. If the Purkinje fibers, if the autorhythmic cells, and the Purkinje fibers are an autorhythmic cell, they're just a much larger autorhythmic cell. The cell itself is a much larger cell that takes up a lot more space and can activate many, many contractile cells at once. If those Purkinje fibers were wiped out, if our autorhythm cells were wiped out, we would still have depolarization of the ventricles because the infrastructure is still, the foundation is still the same. So we would still have this, but instead of getting them all to fire at once, they would fire in sequence like the atria does. And so our wave would be rounded and would take more time. And it would look like what we'd expect it to look like if it was exactly the same without the Purkinje fibers. Does that make sense? We all clear on that? That's a huge foundation of EKG right there.
So I understand that after going out of the AV node and going into the bundle of FIS, that the autorhythmic cells are still sending that entire signal all the way down. When they get to the Purkinje fibers, that's when they actually activate contractile muscle.
Okay.
Down the bundle of HIS, does the bundle of HIS have any connection to contractile cells,
No.
or is it only a conduit?
It's a conduit.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, it's a conduit. There's the bundle of FIS is just the thoroughfare that gets you from the atria to the ventricles through that septum.
Is it myelinated?
It's not a neuron, so there's no myelin.
Okay.
There's no axon. So just
It's electrical system as opposed to
Right.
chemical.
yeah, it's just cell by cell. Does that make sense?
Can you remind me why the S wave happens?
By the way,
S drop?
yeah, I will. In one moment, like right now.
We haven't got there.
Or in just a couple minutes. Yeah, we'll talk about each of those waves. All right, so